Okay. So, colleagues, again, thank you for joining us today. The presentation we're going to listen to for the next 20, 30 minutes is from Cecilia Santilli and Roberto Scaramuzzino, although I understand Cecilia can't be with us today. So Roberto is going to do the whole talk. They're going to talk about, they're going to present a paper entitled Populist Governance, Shaping Political Opportunity Structures, Civil Society Organizations' Access to Policymaking and Public Funding. Now, before giving the floor to Roberto, I would like actually to introduce the authors of this presentation for you today. Cecilia Santilli is a researcher in socio-anthropology at the School of Social Work at Lund University in Sweden. Her primary research interests include civil society, politics, and policies from a comparative perspective. She's currently involved in a research project examining the impact of populism on civil society. And Roberto Scaramuzzino, our speaker today, is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at Lund University in Sweden. His research interests concern the role of civil society in the welfare state. He is currently leading the research project Civil Society and Populism, How the Rise to Power of Populist Parties Affects State Civil Society Relations, a project funded by the Swedish Research Council. So it's all for me. I will give the floor to Roberto to start his presentation. Thank you, Roberto. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michele. What I will be presenting today is common work with Cecilia, and I will share now my PowerPoint in just a second. Does it look okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. So what we're presenting today is this paper that is part of a larger research project titled Civil Society and Populism, How the Rise to Power of Populist Parties Affects State Civil Society Relations. This is a project that has been going on since 2024. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council and has a comparative perspective. It compares civil society across two national contexts, Italy and Sweden. I will talk a little bit more about why these countries, but we can say already from this point that we consider them, in a sense, most different cases, at least in a context of established liberal democracies in Europe. They have different ways of organizing the welfare. Civil society organizations have quite different roles in society, but they share, in a sense, a common feature, which is, of course, relevant for this project, and it is that the electoral outcomes of the election in 2023 brought to power government coalitions that included right-wing populist parties. In different constellations, of course. In Italy, you could say that we have right-wing populist parties in power in the government coalition, while in Sweden we have a right-wing populist party that is part of the coalition supporting the government, but without having ministries directly. As you can imagine, this project runs for 4 years. There are different sub-studies. I will not go into all of them, but what we are presenting today is part of perhaps the main part of this project, which is an interview study that has that draws on research questions and a specific method. The questions are first, we want to know how civil society organizations perceive the changes in consultation practices and in funding. We explore to what extent and how these changes can be understood as part of what we call populist governance, and then to what extent and how these changes impact on political opportunity structures. We do this by interviewing incumbent civil society organizations. And of course, it's a very large population, so we had to, in a sense, narrow it down. And we looked a little bit into what kind of reforms have been pushed by these governments in, for example, state funding that affect civil society. And we chose in Italy reform of the National Fund for Third Sector Projects, and in Sweden, the reform of the national funding for study associations in adult education. Two cases that are chosen strategically because they imply some kind of change, but they are not mere cutbacks on funding, which would, of course, given us a quite interesting data about shrinking civic space, but at the same time, perhaps not as interesting as these reforms that are actually not only shrinking, but also offering opportunities, but perhaps in new terms and conditions. So the theoretical perspectives, we are, and this is very much work in progress. So hope you have understanding that this is not really finished yet. But we work with two different strands of research. The first one is coming perhaps a little bit more from political science with the concept of populist governance, which perhaps a little bit simplified means how populist governments tend to, or government in which we have a strong presence of populist parties tend to govern. And in this style of government, we find in the theory by Moon and Pfeiffer, we find two civil society related dimensions. One is that they tend to avoid intermediate institution, and this is pretty much lies into this strong link between a charismatic leader and the people, and also this kind of anti-elitist approach that many right-wing populist parties have, and then tend to avoid civil society as an intermediary between the citizens and the state. But also this kind of repression, obstruction of civil society organizations and actors that they perceive as oppositional. And this, we think, we would like to link to a classic theory for social movement studies, the political opportunity structure approach, in which we operationalize in two different, we have opportunities for political influence and opportunities for public funding. And these have been treated in this kind of research for a long time. And we want to understand to what extent we can link these two theories and actually see populist governance as something that is changing also political opportunity structures. A little bit about our national cases. We have Italy and Sweden. There is a lot of that we can tell about this context. I try to make it more schematized here, that we look at, if we look at it from a civil society perspective, we have different civil society regimes that affect, of course, the role that civil society has in this context. In Sweden, we have this kind of social democratic welfare system, which is also the way of understanding the role of civil society, at least traditionally, which makes civil society more advocacy oriented. We have a universalistic welfare state and a centralized direct state funding. In Italy, of course, we have a different welfare system, which gives civil society more a service orientation. We have the concept of subsidiarity, which makes many of these welfare provisions based on regional and local level, and hence we have also a fragmented and local funding of civil society activities geared towards service. When it comes to popular institutionalization, we have also different contexts. In Italy, we have a long-term cumulative institutionalization since the mid-90s, gradual normalization, and also consolidation under the present Meloni government. In Sweden, this is much more a new phenomenon, at least when it comes to a strong presence in politics, perhaps not so much as part of the public discourse, but in terms of institutionalization and influence, it's quite recent since the last election, and it can be considered some kind of external shock to the system. And it's based on this Tido agreement, which is an agreement between the Sweden Democrats, which are not part of the government, but they are part of the coalition supporting the government, which makes the government a minority government that is dependent on the support by the Sweden Democrats. And their alliance is based on this kind of agreement, which is a written document that presents some kind of program for this legislation. So we want to look at consultation practices and funding. And if we look at the consultation practices first, we see quite strong changes in the perspective of the civil society organizations. In Sweden, we see a clear contraction of opportunities for participation and influence. There is quite a strong talk about that there is a shift from collective, institutionalized forms of participation to more direct and selective, verticalized form of participation, which are less inclusive, less collaborative in a sense, which are seen by many organizations as some kind of undermining of the representative structures. And also the consultation practices are moving from a political level in which perhaps the aims and the framings of the policies are decided much more to the operational level, in which civil society is invited in terms of being part of an implementation of policies that are being decided in a less collaborative fashion. And there are also the appearance of new politically aligned civil society organizations as interlocutors to the government, which the civil society organization have not seen so much before in this context. So there is also the appearance of new actors that can potentially perhaps be ideologically more close to the present majority. In Sweden, it's a rather different situation. There is this, because there is a strong position by civil society actor that acts as a transmission belt. Instead of having a public authority that, for example, administrates the public funding, we have a civil society organization that works as in replacement of a public authority. So it acts as a public authority, but it is actually a civil society organization. So this creates, of course, some kind of buffer for many organizations, but still we see in the interviews a decreased trust by the government. The organization perceive that the government trusts civil society organization less than before, which is also pushing for increased control of the funding of, especially when it comes to democracy work that these kind of adult education organization pursue. And this, of course, creates anxiety, self-censorship by the organization. And here we see a little bit of this difference between Italy and Sweden, in which in Italy, the civil society organization had quite a strong role as service producers, while in Sweden they work more with advocacy, and so they work with capacity building at the level of civil society, which makes, of course, the democratic function more clear and perhaps a little bit more sensitive to this kind of changes. And we have also an important case of a Muslim association losing completely funding, which is seen as an example of what can happen to organizations that are perceived as going perhaps against a nationalistic, ethnocentric agenda, which many of our interviewees perceive in Sweden. When you look at the funding practices, we see, I think what's interesting here is that perhaps the differences are less clear between Italy and Sweden. We have this kind of common perspective across the two national contexts of less funding and more bureaucracy, which perhaps is not just part of the populist governance. This perhaps we've seen already before with new public management and this kind of movement from voice to service, but also pushing for more control of civil society organizations' activity. In Italy, we see a redefinition of the aims of the support that goes from supporting civil society organizations' ordinary activities to activities decided by the government. So the funding is much more geared towards already decided aims that come with the money. So it's not to support organizational ordinary activities, rather to be more clearly part of an implementation of policy that has been decided by somebody else. But there is also this kind of idea that this new system, because it's so demanding when it comes to bureaucracy, it also favors resourceful civil society organizations in richer municipalities, in richer regions, leaving out perhaps less established civil society organizations that are active also in context where there is less resources. In Sweden, we see a move from quantitative measures when it comes to what the organization produce with the funding to more qualitative measures. And this is something that the organization, in a sense, also appreciate, because there is this idea that the hunt for quantity with the previous system, which was based mostly on how many activities do you do, how many people do you involve in these capacity building activities for adult education, was the reason why you got grants, to more an idea that you need to produce quality. But of course, the interpretation of quality is also problematic, because what is quality then? And that's where sometimes there is a more critical perspective by the civil society organization, that this kind of quality measure are also used to steer organizations' activity towards goals that are more in line with the government. This is framed as coming to terms with civil society organizations' mismanagement, or alleged mismanagement, you could say, because this reform becomes very much part of the public discourse, in which civil society has become increasingly criticized because of cases of mismanagement that are, according to organizations, of course, blown up into something that is not just exceptions to how organizations handle public funding, but also part of how allegedly the sector has become used to get public funding without any control, and hence being able to misuse them without any consequence, pushing, of course, for increased control in this sense. So when we push this into this idea, what elements of populist governance do we have here? I think that when it comes to Italy, if we look at this from the avoidance of intermediate institutions, we have this, on the one hand, we have a push towards, from policy making, from seeing civil society as a partner in policy making, to a partner in policy implementation. Of course, this means a difference for the organization, because you're not part of deciding the goals of the policies or the framing of the policy, or the policy itself. You become part of implementing something that is being decided somewhere else. And also, there is a dilution of the representation of many important actors, because new actors with unclear representational capacity are suddenly invited and with a seat at the table. And hence, of course, the representational role of organizations that are historical, that have tens of thousands of members and a lot of activities, is put on par with new actors that perhaps, at least from the point of view of organizations, lacks this kind of representational capacity or even legitimacy. In Sweden, instead, the avoidance of intermediate institution is more linked to this kind of governance unit that now this role is given to a civil society organization, but there is a constant threat of replacing it with a public authority. This is also part in the TIDO agreement. In this agreement between the Sweden Democrats and the other parties, there is this suggestion that these kind of organizations that work as intermediaries should be replaced by public authorities. And this, of course, in the view of the civil society organization, would increase the government's control over this policy area. And there is also this control of the content of the democratic activities by means of the quality criteria. And moving to the repression, obstruction of opposition civil society organizations, in Italy perhaps is a little bit less evident. We see some kind of competition, bureaucratization, increased service orientations that tend to, at least from a technical point of view, excluding perhaps less established actors that might be a little bit more controversial in a sense. While in Sweden, we see more clear cutting of funding, which of course decrease capacity to be a voice in society. We have a framing of civil society organization as mismanaging funding, which delegitimize them. But also we have this case of denying funding to a Muslim civil society organizations, of course, based on technical arguments, not on ideological ones, but still it becomes a case for many CSOs that could happen to you if you become a target of this kind of heated public debate, and at the same time the legitimation strategy. So it's not considered as a coincidence that it's a Muslim organization that loses funding in this particular time. So a little bit briefly, how do we explain these differences? And here is very much where I think we are still in a very tentative phase of the research. I think we see that Italy has a longer tradition of populist influence in national policy, which is why many Italian CSOs perceive perhaps an acceleration, but it is an acceleration of long-term trends that have been going on for a while. While Swedish civil society organizations perceive quite a more clearer rupture with previous state-civil society relations that have been mostly, you could say, trusts based on trust and some kind of mutual recognition of a mutual interdependency between state and civil society. We think also that the Swedish civil society organization have this kind of more advocacy orientation, which makes them more exposed to general and selective funding cuts, because this goes directly against their possibility to bring forward their voice, while Italian civil society organizations are more exposed to competition and conditional funding, but their capacity of producing services perhaps is not that threatened to that extent. And here perhaps there is also more interest, I don't know, this is something that we talk about, the Italian government perhaps is more dependent on civil society to make the welfare work than the Swedish government is dependent from Swedish civil society organization when it comes to these issues. But one thing that is in common between the countries is that they have this corporatist tradition of interest representation. And but here we also see different strategies. In Italy, we have a more diluted representational role based on also, again, competition by new actors, while in Sweden, the corporatist system seems to be kept, but threatened by control and possible replacement of a civil society actor as the governance unit by a public authority, which of course could not work in the same way as trying to also handle these changes and becoming this kind of intermediary function for civil society organizations. So we have some kind of this, as you see, this has been hypotheses. Now maybe they're not hypotheses anymore. They are more kind of interpretation of what we're going on. It's a little bit back and forth within theory and the empirical data. So it's at a certain point, perhaps we lost a little bit track of what is the result and what are our preconditions for the study. But still, we think there is something in these comparisons. We see the welfare partnership regime and the long-term populist centralization as bringing this kind of welfare dependency and fragmented local funding, which in a way insulates civil society organization from direct national interventions, and changes are hence perceived as minimal or gradual. But at the same time, we see in Italy also this kind of stratified access, long normalization exposed them to oppositional civil society organizations, and changes are perceived as systematic in a sense, but hard to attribute directly to the government and to populist governance. In Sweden, we have this more centralized funding system based on some kind of trust regime that makes changes very visible immediately and as political signals of perhaps more of this kind of systemic change. CSOs are perceived as sharp discontinuity in the political opportunity structure and in the advocacy culture. At the same time as this council that seems to be able to handle the situation and is not really being replaced yet, and I don't think there will be the time to do this in this kind of legislation because we are going to elections in this autumn, so probably the council will not be replaced as suggested in the TIDO agreement, is function as some kind of institutional buffer and like some kind of part of this corporate structure that attenuates the impact of populist governance. And we see the CSOs perceive some kind of pressure, but the formal political opportunity structure remains open as far as the council is concerned to support civil society as independent and critical voice. So that was what I had. So perhaps I could stop the sharing.
Thank you, Roberto, and I will stop the recording.